Hey guys, this is Nick Van Us here with a short video about measurement in education. Now originally when I put this together, I was thinking primarily about IEP goal selection, but really this is applicable to selecting pre-referral intervention goals and essentially any situation you're in where you're trying to select something to measure in relation to student progress monitoring. The first slide is a definition of measurement that I'm pretty fond of. So measurement is a quantitatively expressed reduction of uncertainty based on one or more observations. That's a broad definition, and that's why I like to think about it and come back to it. Because I don't know about you guys, but my memories from education grad school contain so much emphasis on existing tools for measurement. Maybe that's just a school psych thing, but essentially I filled up my brain with so much information about the WIAT and curriculum-based measurement, etc., that the second I entered the field and encountered a situation where there wasn't a clear-cut designated tool for measuring something readily available, I felt a little helpless. And more important, I was often faced with situations where there appeared to be numerous areas where a student was struggling, and the team really needed to come together and narrow it down, figure out where we should focus our efforts, where we're going to see the most bang for the buck. And I think reflecting on that, we often get so attached to specific assessment tools that we're used to using or that they're readily available, and we lose that analytical attitude, that ability to step back and try and figure out what we should be measuring in the first place. This next slide breaks down outcome metrics versus process metrics versus balance metrics. And those terms are the crux of this whole video. Now, I took these labels from frameworks that were written by economists, people with MBAs, and this language is used quite a lot in the healthcare industry, often in the context of quality improvement measures. But regardless of where those terms come from, I'm hoping that as we talk about these terms, you'll connect the same dots that I did, and as an educator, you'll see the relevance of this vocabulary across disciplines. I found just personally that I tend to learn best by trying to make those connections across disciplines. And I attribute that a little bit to being in college, being a psych major, communications minor, and I also took some sociology classes. And once you've learned 3 different terms for essentially the same thing repeatedly, you start to realize that there's quite a bit of common ground in the sciences, and smart folks in economics, sociology, psychology, mathematics tend to come to the same conclusions about what works and what doesn't in application. So anyway, outcome metrics are the big, complicated measurements that we would report to a government agency, outside agencies, things in education like graduation rates or failure rates per student. Kind of like the dependent variable in an experiment, there are many factors that weigh in on those outcome metrics. Process metrics, on the other hand, are the measurements of the processes that influence the outcome metrics. In experimental terms, I think of these as independent variables. Balance metrics aren't necessarily as relevant to IEP goal setting as the other terms, but I still wanted to include that term balance metric in this video because this is a framework, these are terms that are not only relevant for making decisions about specific students, but they're also relevant for making decisions about organizations and systems. And a balance metric is particularly relevant there. It's a measurement of how changes or improvements in one aspect or area of a system affect other areas of the system. So for example, if you're a hospital administrator and you decide that you're going to set a time limit on new parents leaving the hospital, you might turn over your hospital beds faster and see an improvement in that metric, but it may lead to a decrease in patient satisfaction. So when I'm consulting with educators on a systems level, I believe it's crucial to emphasize the value of balance metrics, especially when resource and procedural adjustments are being considered. So say that you're a hospital administrator and you've determined that your infection rates need to go down. Obviously, there are quite a few factors that weigh in on the infection rates in the ICU. For example, how often nurses and doctors are following correct procedures in many different aspects of their jobs. How often are these professionals washing their hands? That's just naming a few of the factors that influence that rate of infection in the ICU. However, if this administrator decides to hold a staff meeting, which is everybody's favorite thing, and focuses too much on outcome metrics, saying, hey everybody, We're going to lower our infection rates in the ICU. And we're going to meet every month and talk about the rate of infections, and it's going to go down. Well, the problem with that scenario is there hasn't been a conversation about the process and a thoughtful analysis of why that number is the way it is, and there hasn't been a plan developed that targets why that number is the way it is. So the plan that this administrator has is not likely to reduce the rate of infection. Perhaps more importantly, say that that rate of infection goes up or it goes down during this plan the administrator has concocted. If either of those things happen, if that rate of infection goes up or it goes down, without an understanding of the processes behind it, it's unlikely that we'll be able to pinpoint exactly why that number shifted. We may give ourselves undue credit and then cry foul in a month or so if the number shoots back up. Who knows? What we do know, especially in the case of hospitals that have analyzed their quality improvement efforts, is that focusing on process metrics is far more likely to result in an effective initiative and a sustainable change. For example, if the hospital administrator rethinks his efforts and decides he's going to measure hand washing rates and discuss this information with hospital staff, if that hand washing rate is indeed an important process metric, which in this case it very much is, hospital infection rates are likely to fall. So if I'm an educator and I'm thinking about this the same way, say I want a student's failure rate to go down and their coursework completion rate to go up. I currently work in a high school, and I can tell you from experience that what parents and educators truly care about is students earning their credits and graduating from high school. That's what matters at the end of the day. But it doesn't change the fact that when a student isn't completing their work and isn't on track to graduate, we can feel a little bit helpless because there are so many processes and factors involved in that outcome metric of coursework completion, earning credits. Regardless, if we focus too much on that outcome metric, we're unlikely to be effective. We can fall into the same trap that the hospital could have fallen into. So for example, if the student's rate of homework completion goes up, we might give ourselves some credit only to feel helpless a few months later when it slides right back down again. To create true growth and a sustained change in the outcome metric, it's vital to focus on high impact variables that are process metrics. So in this example, if I focus on increasing a student's time management skills and measure that, improvement in that area could factor heavily into improvements in the outcome metric of higher coursework completion and reduced failure rates. More importantly, I now understand the processes behind that outcome metric of coursework completion, and I can explain changes in that outcome metric of coursework completion. The next thing I want to talk about is practicality. So in my experience working with special education teachers and other educators, pretty much everything that I've said so far in this video is understood at some level already. But it really doesn't affect the team's decision making if there isn't an understanding about how to measure what we truly care about. That how is vitally important. And this is something you could predict because there's actually a term for when organizations measure things that are easier to measure even if they don't necessarily have a high impact on what we care about. And that term is measurement inversion. So looking at this handy chart, you see that when I say measurement inversion, I'm referring to that tendency again to measure low impact variables that are easier to measure. They're easier to measure. We may know that they're low impact, but we're going to measure them. That's measurement inversion. Now I work in public education, so when I give this presentation live, I'm very clear that I'm not advocating for jumping clear across that chart to high impact variables that are extremely difficult to measure. I don't think that's practical. I think as a team, we need to understand the vital importance of finding high impact variables to measure in the first place, and then we need to work thoughtfully to measure them in the least difficult and most efficient manner possible. Our goal, though, is to measure process metrics and to isolate high-impact variables. So just an illustration of how difficult that can be when I just say isolate high-impact variables for some students. The primary variable in the process may be deficient organizational skills. They just can't keep their materials and deadlines straight. they haven't developed those skills. That weakness in the process affects coursework completion more than any other. For another student, less developed emotional regulation skills may be the key variable with the highest impact on the student's coursework completion. Perhaps the student is missing so much time in the classroom because they're dysregulated emotionally that they're behind, they're missing instruction, they're missing when the teacher mentions deadlines, so they don't even have an opportunity to write those deadlines down. The point is that problem analysis and information gathering, and whether that's using the RIOT framework, review, interview, observe, test, or something more formal like a full-blown special education evaluation, that information gathering process, the intention of that is to provide school teams with the information needed to make a thoughtful determination regarding which variables in the process we can consider high impact, and we go from there. So, Nick, what do I do with all of this? I'm convinced that I've isolated a high impact process variable and I want to measure it. How do I do that? The examples on this slide relate primarily to social, emotional, organizational skills, but really we don't have to narrow our scope that much. Say that you're an algebra teacher and a student is struggling on a complicated algebra problem. You would analyze the processes of solving that problem to determine if the student is really struggling with arithmetic or a specific part of the concept, so you can concentrate your efforts on that part of the process of solving that complicated algebra problem. That's an example of isolating high-impact process metrics that happens in classrooms every day. So with the examples I have on this slide, checklists, rubrics, and direct behavior ratings, I'm trying to provide examples of tools that can be effective for monitoring student growth in the realm of social, emotional, organizational skills. To create a direct behavior rating, a behavior is defined in clear, observable terms, and an individual, often a classroom teacher, who has first-hand experience with the student, rates the behavior following a specified observation period. Rubrics and checklists are tools that state specific criteria. Often you'll see boxes on a rubric filled with descriptions of that specific criteria, and they allow teachers and educators to evaluate what students can do in relation to those outcomes. So compared to direct behavior ratings, rubrics and checklists are often more appropriate and helpful, I found, when a behavior is difficult to observe in most settings. So for example, if a student is working on coping skills in a small group, the teacher running that small group may use a rubric to evaluate the student's skill growth, simply because a classroom teacher using a direct behavior rating would have fewer opportunities to observe that covert coping skill behavior. If you're watching this on my website, currently you'll see a link to example direct behavior ratings, rubrics, and checklists on the teacher resources page. If you're not watching this on my website, I truly hope that whoever is showing you this video has examples of those tools at the ready. If not, I would recommend that looking for those examples would be your next step. If this video made sense to you, and I really hope that it did, you probably want to do something with this information. Maybe adjust how your IEP teams are selecting goals, maybe re-examine what tools you're currently using to monitor said goals. Regardless, actually having those example tools available makes a pivotal difference in translating those desires into action. I wish you luck, and thank you very much for your time today.